Chapter 11. Last Chance. We did all we could to discourage the whales from coming in too close to the shore. Shouting and screaming at the water's edge, we hurled stones and driftwood at them, but most fell short, and those few that did hit them did not seem to deter them. The birdmen's flock of gulls wheeled noisily overhead, but the whales took no notice of them either. All the time they were drifting closer and closer to the beach and disaster. Every faint whistle from the stranded whale seemed to drive the others out in the bay to distraction, sending them rolling and plunging in amongst each other and precipitating a chorus of thunderous snorting and whistling that subsided only when the whale lay still and silent again on the sand. But each furious flurry of activity left them that much nearer to the shore, and there seemed nothing we could do now to stop the beaching themselves. "Gracie," said the birdman, "you go back to the whale and try to keep her happy. Stroke her, Gracie. Talk to her, sing to her, anything so she doesn't call out." And he took off his sou'wester and handed it to me. "It won't do to let her get too dry either, Gracie. You use this for a bucket." So I went back and forth from the water's edge to the whale with the birdman's sou'wester full of water. I began at her head, pouring the water all over her eyes and mouth. She seemed to relish it, blinking and rolling her head from side to side as the water ran down over her skin and into the sand, and all the while I talked to her quietly. I remember thinking as I looked into her eyes that she could understand me, and she could understand every word I said. I was kneeling in the sand beside her, stroking her behind the blowhole above her eyes, when I saw them coming back. They were hurrying along the path under Guil Hill, Big Tim running out in front. It looked as if he had brought most of the island with him. Everyone had a weapon of some kind in his hand, a fork, an axe, a hoe, or scythe, and Daniel's father carried a harpoon over his shoulder. I looked for Mother amongst them, but could not pick her out. The vicar was there, his cassock tucked up into his trousers, and Mr. Well-Beloved was there too, striding out with his stick alongside Daniel's father. "Stay where you are, Gracie," the birdman told me, "and keep her quiet if you can." By the time they reached the beach, the birdman, Daniel, and Prince stood between them and the stranded whale. No one spoke for a moment. They all stood looking incredulously at the birdman and the whale, and Daniel and me, whispering anxiously amongst themselves. It was only when they noticed the rolling black backs breaking the water out in the bay that they began to talk aloud. "See!" Big Tim shouted in triumph, pointing his machete. "Didn't I tell you? Didn't I tell you? There's dozens of them out here." I said there was. "It's a narwhal," said Mr. Well-Beloved. "Yes, I do believe it's a narwhal." "Well, I never. Only the males have tusks, you know. He's a long way from home. That's the kind of whales that Eskimos hunt off Greenland. Quite what he's doing here, I cannot imagine. If I might take a closer look." As he stepped towards us, Prince began to growl, his lip curling back above his teeth, his neck tense with fury. Mr. Well-Beloved stopped where he stood. "Look here, Mr. Woodcock," Daniel's father said, taking Mr. Well-Beloved's arm and pulling him back. "We don't much care what this thing is. Whale, narwhal, it doesn't matter to us. All that matters is that there's meat on it, and ivory too, by the look of it. That's money to us, Mr. Woodcock. Anything washed up on our beaches is ours by right. Always has been, Mr. Woodcock. You know that." The birdman said nothing, but looked along the ranks of islanders that faced him. "And as for you, Daniel Pender," Daniel's father went on, pointing at Daniel, "you can come right back over here else I'll take a strap to you right here and now in front of all these people. You've no business to be here with this man. You've been told time and time again." Daniel stayed where he was, alongside the birdman. "You can strap me all you want, Father," he said, "but you got to listen to Mr. Woodcock. You got to listen to him. If you don't, then we're done for, all of us. You got to do what he says, Father." Mr. Woodcock, Daniel's father, said, his patience fast vanishing, "Are you going to move that dog, or am I? Now I don't want anyone to get hurt." "He can't hear you, Father," Daniel said. "He's deaf. Gracie and me were the only ones he can understand." "Deaf?" said Daniel's father, and he was clearly taken aback. "All right, then you tell him for us, Daniel. You tell him that the whale belongs to all of us, and we aim to kill it, and those out there in Popplestones as well. They're ours by right, and he can't stop us. Tell him to stand aside." Daniel interpreted quietly, and the birdman nodded, his understanding, putting his hand on Daniel's shoulder. He straightened up and faced Daniel's father. "Then you will have to kill me first," he said. "This whale must go back to the sea where she belongs. Then we must drive them all back out to sea. If just one of them dies, the curse that fell on Samson when I was a boy will fall on you, and Briar will be cursed forever. You must help me before it's too late." "Oh, come on," said Big Tim, pushing his way through. "We don't have to listen to this old fool. Those whales out there could turn around any minute and head back out to sea. We'd lose the lot of them." And the crowd began to move slowly in towards us. "Stand aside, Mr. Woodcock," said Daniel's father. "You know we're within our rights. Out of the way now." At once Prince was on his feet, and the growl had turned to a snarl. Those just in front of him fell back, but the rest kept coming until we were almost surrounded. At that moment, the whale must have sensed danger, for they raised her head and whistled again, twisting and turning and thrashing the ground behind her. Popplestone's base suddenly boiled with life. "Don't do it! Please, Father!" cried Daniel, backing down towards me. "Don't do it! Listen to him. He's telling the truth. I know he is." But I could see from the hardness in the face around me that they were ignoring him, that they were no longer even listening as they closed in around us. "Wait!" It was a voice from that back of the crowd, a voice I knew. "Wait!" Everyone looked round. They hushed instantly and then stood to one side as my mother came forward, Auntie Mildred beside her. Mother looked first at me and then at the birdman. "You were up early this morning, Gracie," she said. "I wondered where you'd gone to." "Had to go, Mother," I said, standing up. I had to. Daniel came for me. Big Tim and all of them, they were going to attack the birdman's cottage. Daniel heard them planning it, so we had to warn him, didn't we? "Were they indeed?" said Mother, looking around. There was a hard edge to her voice I had never heard before. "Did you know that, Mr. Pender?" she asked. And Daniel's father looked hard at Big Tim. "Well, he deserved it," said Big Tim. "He was signaling to German submarines. I know he was. We seen him, didn't we?" But none of his friends supported him now. Mother walked across to Big Tim and looked him in the eye. "You know nothing, Tim Pender, because you don't think. You never have. You know only what you want to know. You're a bully and a coward, and you should be ashamed of yourself." And she turned and spoke to the crowd. "This old man helped me and Gracie. He left honey and milk and bread on my doorstep when we needed it most. Just like you, I've known him all my life and never spoken to him, but in all that time, I've never known him harm anyone. Yes, every one of us is frightened of him, and we tell our children to keep out of his way. But what has he ever really done to harm any one of us?" There was silence. Mother came over to me and took me by the hand. "I don't know what Gracie and Daniel have been up to, and I don't know why Mr. Woodcock wants to save these creatures. I do know we owe it to him, and to the two children at least, to listen to them, to hear them out. If after that you still want to kill the whales, then you can. They'll still be there." She did not wait for approval, she assumed it. She turned to Daniel. "Tell us, Daniel. Tell us all about it." And not a word was raised against her. I wondered at the time that she was able to command such instant obedience. On reflection, I think, everyone was as shocked as I was at the sudden transformation in her. I certainly had never seen her so authoritative and passionate. All I know is that without a murmur, even from Big Tim, they all backed away and waited shamefaced for Daniel to begin. Daniel turned to Mr. Woodcock. "Shall I tell them?" he asked, and the old man nodded. "Tell them," he said. "Tell them everything. But hurry, Daniel, hurry. There's no time to lose." They listened intently as Daniel told them of how the birdman and his mother had witnessed the massacre of the whales on Samson all those years ago, how they had tried to stop it and failed, that it was the islanders' greed and cruelty that had brought the curse down on Samson. He told them the whole terrible story of the death of Samson, of the ghost ship, of the starvation and disease that followed, of all the ships drawn to their destruction, of the rocks of Samson, of the dogs the people had to eat to survive. As the truth behind the age-old rumors came out, the islanders listened all the more closely. They heard how the people left one by one until finally the well had dried up and forced the birdman and his mother off the island. For some time, no one said anything. They looked at each other uneasily, and then it was Big Tim that spoke up. "So what? We don't know that any of it is true, do we? We could be making it all up, couldn't he? Where's the proof?" "The proof's Samson," Daniel said. "I've seen it, and Gracie's seen it too. We've seen the horn, haven't we, Gracie? In Mr. Woodcock's cottage on Samson, it was hanging above the stove. Just like that one it is," he said, pointing at the whale. "You been over there, Gracie?" Mother asked me. "You been over to Samson?" "We couldn't help it, Mother," I said. "It was that night we went out fishing and the fog came down. Never told you before, 'cause I knew you'd be angry. Didn't know where we were, Mother, honest. Couldn't see a thing. Then we saw this light and rode towards it. We thought it was Briar at first, but it turned out it was the birdman's fire on Samson. He lights a fire on Samson whenever there's bad weather. It's to keep the ships away from the rocks." Suddenly, Mother was beside me. Hands on hips, she faced the crowd. "Well," she said, "what are you waiting for? If we don't hurry, every one of those whales will be on the beach, and then we'll never be able to get them off. We need a sail to roll her onto, and we need ropes. We'll need a horse or a donkey, both maybe, to haul her back into the sea. Hurry now." This time there were no arguments. On the contrary, there was a sudden stir of excitement. Somehow Mother had galvanized the whole island into action. The vicar and Auntie Mildred organized every spare man, woman, and child into an extended line at the water's edge. There must have been 100 people. They were advancing into the sea to keep the whales from coming in. Waist high in the water, they were whistling and shouting and splashing, whilst behind them the rescue began. It was Daniel's father who directed the delicate task of engineering the stranded whale back into the sea. "Got to launch her gently, just like she was a boat," he said. They dug a deep trench to one side of her, and when the sail came, they laid it in the bottom. Then they dug away the side of the ditch she was lying in and eased her sideways, rocking her gently until she slid down onto the sail. It took 12 men pushing the birdman, Mr. Well-Beloved, and Daniel's father amongst them before the whale was finally in place. All through the rescue, I stayed by the whale's head whilst an endless relay of children with buckets, Big Tim and his friends mostly, fetched and carried water to keep the whale's skin wet. She was trying quietly now. Her flourishes were less and less frequent, and she had fallen almost silent. She moved quickly from time to time, her tiny eyes often closing for minutes on end so that sometimes I thought she might be dead. A bucket of water poured gently over her head seemed to revive her, but each time it took longer. She would open her wedge-shaped mouth under the horn and allow the water to trickle in through her teeth. I talked to her all the while, reassuring her as well as I could that it would not be long now before she was back with her friends and out at the sea again. I could feel her breath on my fingers as I stroked to the top of her head around her blowhole. She was breathing less often now and more deeply, almost as if she were going to sleep. Or was she dying slowly? Friend and another donkey were hitched up already to the sail. At first it looked as if it would not be strong enough for the task. Their feet sank deep into the sand as they pulled, and the whale did not move. What the birdman said into Friend's ear, no one heard. No one knows, but whatever it was, enough, for they were soon hauling the whale down across the wet sand towards the sea. There were a dozen men or more straining at the sail at each side so that the whale was returned to the water cradled in a kind of hammock. I stood back and watched with the others as the waves washed over her and she gradually came back to life. On the birdman's advice, we left her there wallowing in the shallows for some time, giving her time to regain her strength, to feel her buoyancy. Then, to our delight, she began to heave and thrash again, and she let out a long wailing whistle that seemed enough to satisfy the birdman, and we gathered around her and pushed her through the water towards the others that lay waiting for her out in the bay. There was a flurry out in the middle when she joined them, and much rolling and groaning and whistling, an exultant chorus of joy at their reunion. Then she became one of them, and I was never sure which she was after that. I thought, as everyone thought, that the job was done then, that once reunited, they would turn for the open sea, but for some reason they seemed reluctant to leave the bay in spite of all we did to frighten them away. Big Tim it was who suggested that banging on tin trays and corrugated iron might do the trick. So we, children, were all sent home to fetch back any bit of sheet metal we could find that would serve as a drum. It was a good idea, and the first time we all thundered on our makeshift drums. It seemed to have an effect, for they turned and swam away. But then they stopped at the mouth of the bay and turned back again, setting up such a row of whistling, whooping, and snorting, so that you could almost have thought they were talking back to our drums. Far from driving them away, the drumming only seemed to interest them and excite them. All day long the islanders sustained this frantic effort. Everyone took turns in the water now, for it was too cold to stay there long. Hot soup and bread were brought out to the beach and kept warm over a fire in one corner of the beach, so that a ready supply of food was on hand all day. We had one brief taste of success when a pair of the whales was spotted swimming out to sea past Wheel Rock. However, the others did not follow, so that by nightfall most of the whales were still trapped in Popplestones, unable or unwilling to find their way out. The birdman, Daniel, and I were sitting drinking our soup by the fire when the birdman had the idea. His face was ashen with cold and exhaustion, but suddenly there was an urgency in his voice. "Look where they are," he said, getting to his feet and pointing out into the bay. "Look at them." The whales were lying together in a pack in the dark waters on the far side of Popplestones. "It's the fire," he said. "It's the fire. They're as far from the fire as they can be. They don't like fire." Flaming torches, oil lamps, piles of burning brushwood and driftwood. We used anything that would burn. We lit fires all along the rocks around the bay. And then the birdman, with a long line of islanders on either side of him waving their torches above their heads, waded out into the sea towards the whales. We children were told to stay on the beach. It was too dangerous now, out in the dark water with the whales' flailing tails and the sea whipped up into a frenzy by a fresh offshore wind. So we stayed and watched the line of torches as they moved out into the bay. Only minutes later, they brought the birdman back. Daniel's father and the vicar carried him out of the sea. A wave had knocked the breath out of him, Daniel's father said, as they laid him down by the fire beside us. "I'll be all right," the birdman said, struggling onto his elbows. "Let me get out of there. We need everyone out of there." "I think you've done enough, Mr. Woodcock," said the vicar. They're turning. We can manage without you now. You nearly drowned out there. You stay here and rest." And much against his will, he did. Mother put a blanket around him, and Daniel and I huddled close to him, and Prince came to lie down at our feet. "Maybe it'll be all right, children," the birdman said. "Maybe it will be, after all." It was the line of flaming torches that at last made the whales leave for the open sea, for which a final flourish of triumphant whistling and snorting, and shooting great fountains into the air, they swam out past Wheel Island and left us in the gathering dark. A great cheer went up all around the bay, but beside us the birdman was still not happy. He was on his feet again by now. He made everyone build beacons all along the beach to be sure they did not come back during the night. And even when almost everyone had left Popplestones for home, he still would not go. Mother asked him to come home with us. She begged him to come. "Tell him it's a cold night, Daniel, and he can't sleep in a house with no windows. He's soaked to the skin. Tell him he must come home with us." Daniel told him, and the birdman smiled and shook his head. "I'll be warm enough by the fire," he said. "I shall stay here, and Prince will stay with me to keep me company. Won't you, Prince? Maybe later, when it gets light, I'll take the boat out. I want to be sure they've gone. Got to be sure they don't come back. You take those 2 children of mine home before they catch cold." And as we were leaving, he called out without turning round, "It's over now, children. The curse of Samson is redeemed. Finished. All will be well now. I promise you. You'll see." So we left him there in the glow of the fire with Prince sitting beside him. As we went, we saw the gulls settling on the beach all around him, and from nowhere his one-legged kitawake flew up and landed on his shoulder. No one ever saw the birdman again. They found his sou'wester washed up on Hell Bay some days later, but his boat was never found. I've always thought that he knew he might not be coming back, because otherwise he would have never have left Prince behind on the beach. And because of the remnants of shell message we found the next morning in the sand beside the dog. The shells were scattered, but we could still make out the letters ZW.